Hi everyone, Valerie and I are on our annual break over the northern summer, and we would really hate for you to miss your weekly nerd out with us. So we visited the Nerd Vault and pulled out some of our favourite and I think most useful episodes. This week we are revisiting the opening episode in Season 2, Legally Blonde. Valerie studied the hero's gift express, and this little discussed secret is a key to making the ending of your story work. And this topic is the closest you'll come to an Easter egg in storytelling theory. It really is the secret sauce of character development. Now, I was studying Forces of Antagonism, and again, this was a deliberate choice. I was ensuring that I understood how the forces of antagonism oppose the protagonist in my novel, Jet. And what this season confirmed for me was that having different types of forces of antagonism is all right. And most importantly, that the forces of antagonism aren't always villains. Sometimes these forces of antagonism create positive challenges for the protagonist to overcome, not just negative ones. But the two most important realizations I had were that the protagonist is only as strong as the forces of antagonism they face, and that there are requirements for forces of antagonism. Now, next week, please join us for a special episode. Valerie is going to quiz me about my middle grade novel, Jet Cooper, and we're going to discuss how I studied story theory across multiple mediums and put that into practice in this novel. And I'll even share where you can get a copy. Until then, sit back and enjoy Legally Blonde. If you want to be a better writer, there are 3 things you need to do. First, understand storytelling principles. Second, see how other writers have applied those principles. And then, thirdly, use those in your own work. Here on the Story Nerd podcast, our goal is to demystify story theory. We'll help you with the first 2 steps so that you can get started with the third. I'm Melanie Hill, writer, editor and poet, and I have a passion for middle grade and young adult stories, spy stories, fairy tales and master detective novels.
And I'm Valerie Francis. I'm a writer and literary editor, and I focus on stories by, for and about women.
On today's episode, Valerie pitched Legally Blonde so that we can study the hero's gift expressed. This 2001 film was directed by Robert Luchtig from an original screenplay by Karen McCullough-Lutz and Kirsten Smith. And just a reminder that there will be spoilers because we can't talk about the movie without talking about the movie.
Alrighty, why don't we start with a little discussion of genre, shall we? So season 1 obviously was all about genre, but season 2, I'm going to talk about the hero's gift expressed, and Melanie is going to talk about forces of antagonism. Now, that said, we both decided it would be a good idea just to state off the top of each show what the genre of the film is that we're going to watch, because it's good practice for us, but it's also useful for you. One of the most common things that writers ask Melanie and me is for a list of stories that are examples of particular genres. Well, if we state the genre of the film we're about to watch, then we'll all build up a repertoire that we can refer back to when we need to. One thing to note, though, unless otherwise specified, we're going to follow the story grid concept of genre because we both find it very useful and very practical, and I'm all about that. Now, of course, the story grid method is based on the work of Robert McKee, Basim El-Wakil, and Norman Friedman. So at some point, if you want to, you can dive into those materials as well to help deepen your understanding. Now, there is a concept that did not come up in season 1 that I just want to mention briefly here. Everything in story exists in a hierarchy, and that includes genre. So it's not unusual for a story to have a primary genre, which is the genre of the whole global story, and a secondary genre. Typically, one of them will relate to the change that's happening within the protagonist, and the other refers to the change that's happening in the outside world. So, in my opinion, the genre for Legally Blonde is the primary genre is a performance business story, and the secondary genre is a status sentimental, although because this is a classical arc plot or heroic journey structure, there's an obvious worldview maturation element to it because that's baked in to the arc plot structure.
So, Valerie, that's really interesting that you picked performance as the global genre. Can you let me know what it is why did you choose that one particularly for the global?
Well, I gave some thought to the global genre of this, and Elle's objects of desire shift a little bit as the story goes on, but the whole film builds up to the climactic point of Elle in the courtroom defending her client, and she's a first-year law student. So although the story starts with her wanting to get married and wanting Warner to propose to her, it shifts to her wanting to become a great lawyer. And that's what the climactic action is all about. And that's where we see Elle end at the end. She becomes a great lawyer. So I thought it was performance business. And of course, a great pairing with performance is status. And I do see it as status because status is sort of a funny genre because externally it can be rising in rank somehow. Now, Elle starts out as a very wealthy young woman, so she's not rising in rank financially. But if you think about how she comes into Harvard Law School, she's a bit of a joke to everybody. Like, no one takes her seriously. She's, way down on the bottom rung. But she finishes as the valedictorian. So within that ecosystem of Harvard Law, she has risen in status. So that's how I came up with that.
That's really interesting because, I was looking at this as well, and there were parts of it, particularly towards the end, where you could almost put in a bit of a crime genre as well, which fitted into the legal world that Elle is going through, because the ultimate thing that happens is in the court case is they find out who done it. So I find it really interesting sometimes that there's an interplay between genres, but at some point I think what we're saying to everybody is that you have to pick one and you have to stick with it. So I think it's really good to explore that, and thanks for expanding on why you chose performance.
Yeah, it is neat. There's often elements, but like you said, you got to pick one. Okay, so my topic for season 2 is the hero's gift expressed. And as I mentioned in the last episode, the hero's gift is one of those storytelling tricks that very few people understand or talk about. At least I don't see it mentioned in very many craft books or on writerly types of platforms. But it's a key element in making the ending of your story work. It's not the only one. There's a couple of things, but this is certainly one of the biggies. So what is it? Where did it come from? And why do we care? Why does it matter? Well, the hero's gift comes from the arc plot or classical story form, which is the hero's journey. And in its most basic form, the gift is something that the protagonist does particularly well. We get a glimpse of it at the beginning of the story typically, and then it comes back around again at the end of the story. And when the protagonist expresses this gift, she's able to get out of the mess that she's gotten herself into and be victorious. So when the gift is expressed, the story typically has a happy or an up ending. And typically, if the protagonist does not express the gift, then the end of the story is sad or it's a down ending. Now, this is obviously a general rule of thumb, and I'm sure there are plenty of exceptions, but we have to start somewhere when we're studying this or any storytelling principle. And honestly, it's easiest to start with the principle in its quote unquote purest form or original form or most basic form. We got to start somewhere, so why not here? Think of the hero's gift as the protagonist's superpower. Now, it takes a bit of practice to identify this in a film or a novel, but just like riding a bike, once you got it, you got it. And right now, as you're listening to this podcast, you might not have any idea what your own protagonist's gift is. And that's fine. But start giving it a little bit of thought. And once you've started to recognize the hero's gift in movies that you watch or the books that you read, it'll be a little easier to identify your own character's gift. And if you haven't yet given him or her one, start thinking about what it could be and how it could help your story. So, why does all this matter? Well, it matters because toward the end of the second act of your story, assuming a 3-act structure, your protagonist is going to hit what's called an all is lost moment, which is also called the dark night of the soul. They're going to be as far from their goal as possible. And if you've done your job properly, your reader won't have any idea how the character is going to get out of that hole that they've gotten themselves into. The reader will not be able to see how it's possible for your character to achieve their goal and triumph. It matters also because the hero's gift is a key ingredient to crafting the ending of your story. And it's going to get your readers excited. When people finish the story on a high note, they're going to tell your friends about it. They're going to recommend your book, or they're going to buy your book as a gift. Melanie, what do you think about the concept of the hero's gift expressed?
Well, I'm a big fan of the hero's gift expressed because I think it actually anchors the protagonist, and I think it can stop magical character arcs from occurring. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think it's where the hero changes so much that they become unrecognizable by the end of the story, or they do something that is completely out of character in response to the climactic crisis. The hero's gift is with the hero throughout the whole story, and it shows, I think, the potential that already exists in the hero in the beginning, and then you get to see it fully realised, as you mentioned, by the end of the story. Ever since you and I discussed this concept a few years ago, I see it used very effectively in some stories. And a very obvious example of the hero's gift, I think, is in Top Gun, where, Maverick's gift is being a maverick. But what Pete Mitchell actually learns is that there are times and places to let Mav out of the bag, so to speak. But I also was thinking about this in relation to 3 billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri. And I actually think the character of Jason doesn't have a hero's gift. And so what happens is that the magical character arc happens where he is a completely different person at the end compared to where he is at the beginning, and there's no anchor point. So I do see that this is something very helpful for writers to pick about their main character, and then also guide them through the story and give them a tool at the end to actually find a resolution. So I'm very excited to see what you discover and put forward about the hero's gift express this season.
All righty. Now, before we get into it, I just want to give a word about studying modern films. Now, obviously, we're studying films here on the podcast, and that's because all stories, regardless of the medium, use the same general principles. Also, because we can actually watch and analyze a film per week, and there is just no way we'd be able to watch to read and analyze a book every week. And even if we did, there's no way that you would be able to read and analyze a book every week and keep up with us. But films and novels are obviously not the same thing. So it's not an apples to apples comparison. For novelists, the only thing that we have to work with are words on a page and our reader's imagination. We've got 26 characters and a handful of punctuation. That's it. So it means that our stories have got to be rock solid because there is nowhere for us to hide. Nowhere. If we don't know what we're doing, it shows really fast. Movies have access to soundtracks, costume designers, cinematographers, actors, not to mention CGI. I tend to refer to all these things as spectacle. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. But as novelists, when we study movies, we have to be aware that sometimes, as we saw last season, the spectacle of movies eclipses the storytelling. As an audience member watching a film for 2 hours, we're so caught up in the spectacle that we don't even notice that there's not much of a story. And a great example of this is, again, Top Gun Maverick. I wonder how often this is going to come up, Melanie. We keep mentioning this movie. there is very little story in that film, but holy cow, those flying scenes are just awesome. And, my daughter informs me that the shirtless Miles Teller scene is also pretty rock solid. That's all she's been talking about. So Rogue One and Dune are similar. We saw that last season, and a lot of the Marvel movies fall into that category as well, but not all of them, not by any stretch of the imagination. And I'm not saying that to criticize movies. I'm really not. Movies and novels are different, and obviously the creators are going to lean into what each form of storytelling does well. Now, in saying all of that, Legally Blonde has a fantastic story structure, and therefore there's a lot that novelists can learn from it. And it just so happens that it's also a brilliant example of the hero's gift expressed. It's a pretty obvious example, and that's why I chose it, because hopefully it'll help illustrate this concept really well. So, Elle's gift lies in her knowledge of all things fashion and beauty, and we're shown this repeatedly throughout the movie. In the opening credits, and the first scene, in fact, Elle is much like any of the other women in the sorority. But it's in the second scene, where she's shopping for her engagement dress, that we're shown that Elle's gift goes beyond that of her sorority sisters. About 4 minutes and 38 seconds into the movie, Elle demonstrates her knowledge and her gift. It's not simply that she can pick out a nice outfit. She's not a dumb blonde spending daddy's money, as the sales associate thinks she is. She understands the details of fashion, the fabric that the clothes are made from, the appropriate stitching to use with that fabric, and exactly when the dress was revealed to the world. And she mentions last June's Vogue. About 11 minutes into the movie, Amy, who's one of the sorority sisters, knocks on Elle's door and asks her for help in applying her lip liner. Now, there's a whole house of beautiful women, all of whom could easily show Amy how to apply lip liner. But it's Elle's advice that she seeks. Why is this important? Because it shows that Elle's gift is recognized by those in her ordinary world. Now, at about 13 minutes, 50 seconds, all the way to about 18 minutes, 20 seconds, here's what we learn. This is all about Elle's gift, okay? Elle has a 4.0 GPA, which is the highest GPA in her sorority, and her major is fashion merchandising, which means she knows more about the fashion and beauty industry than someone who merely reads Vogue. Her professors have given her excellent references. That's not explicitly on the screen, but we know it happens because it's a requirement to get into Harvard, and she gets into Harvard. She's president of her sorority. She thinks outside of the box, right, as evidenced by her admissions video. She gets a 179 on the LSATs, which is higher than the 175 she needed. Now, all of this seems like pretty silly, fluffy stuff when we first see it. That's kind of the point, right? The viewer is kind of just going along with this fun, kind of bubbly character, and we're kind of, even though we empathize with Elle, we're not really taking her seriously as a law student. And that's kind of the point. It's not until things get tough for her in the second half of the movie that all of these skills, that all these little things that we've been told in the beginning of the movie, they all come into play and ultimately lead to Elle's triumph. Now, from about 20 minutes to about the 1 hour mark, this is the extraordinary world that Elle goes into. It's Harvard Law. And it's definitely not a place where her gift is a common skill. She's called a Barbie doll. There's lots of raised eyebrows and double takes about how she presents herself and what she wears, and her heart-shaped notebook and the pen with all the feathers. Oh my God, it's great. This helps Elle stand out in the extraordinary world. Like, she is not in her normal environment. She doesn't stand out physically very much in the sorority, right? Because all of the other people in that world are just like Elle physically. They're all beautiful. They're all well put together and all that kind of stuff. When we get to Harvard Law, even just the color scheme, Elle is in very bright, vibrant colors. Everyone else is in sort of muted earth tones. And because she is not like everybody else in this extraordinary world, it means that Elle can do things and have insights that those who are part of the extraordinary world cannot. So in the last half an hour or so of the movie, we see that Elle's gift is able to help her be a better lawyer. She gets Brooke's trust. This is the client who won't trust the very expensive lawyer she has. She trusts Elle because they're sorority sisters. She's also able to speak to the ex-wife because she also understands how things are in a spa, right? One of the other lawyers says of the spa, he says to Elle, "Isn't that your mothership?" Right? She gets the opportunity to go and interview this potential witness. Elle is also able to discredit the pool boy as a witness. And she's able to prove that his claim that he'd had an affair with Brooke is a lie. And how does she know? Well, because the pool boy notices Elle's shoes. Okay, yes, absolutely. This is totally a perpetuation of a stereotype that gay men are not only well dressed, but very well versed in fashion. Yes. But in terms of Elle's gift, it demonstrates that she's not only familiar with the material items in the fashion world, like how dresses are made and all that kind of stuff, and what the beauty industry is all about, but she understands the customers of the industry. So this is a 360-degree view of that world, which shows us how deep her gift is. She knows fashion and beauty inside out, upside down, backward and forward, and nobody else in this whole film can touch her. So finally, the biggest expression of Elle's gift comes in the climax of the whole movie, and this is when she discredits the stepdaughter who's on the stand. And Elle gets the stepdaughter to confess to killing her father, in fact, which obviously then lets Brooke off the hook. She can go free. Now, how does she do that? Well, the stepdaughter has claimed to have been in the shower washing her hair when her father was killed. But Elle knows that this can't possibly be true because the stepdaughter has a perm. And she says that she has come from the hair salon and she came home and got a shower. Because of Elle's gift and everything she knows about this industry, she knows that anyone who has gotten a perm cannot wash their hair for at least 24 hours or they will lose their curls. And the stepdaughter is sitting there in the witness box with big bouncy curls. There's a lot of curls. The perm clearly held. So that discredits the stepdaughter. She not only did she get caught for telling a lie because she wasn't in the shower washing her hair, but it tricks her into confessing to the murder. So there you go. That's a sort of a whistle-stop tour of what the hero's gift is and how it is used and expressed in Legally Blonde. And as we go through the rest of the episodes this semester, or this season rather, I'll start doing this to all of the other movies so that you can see all of the different manifestations of the hero's gift and how it's expressed and how other writers have incorporated this storytelling principle into their work. Melanie.
So I just want to say that Elle was spot on with her knowledge of perm technology, because I have had perms a long time ago where I didn't listen to the hairdresser's advice and I washed my hair and it didn't work out very well. But it was a very interesting and you're right. I think it was an excellent example of the hero's gift expressed. So this season, I'm studying Forces of Antagonism because it's the conflict between the protagonist and the force or forces of antagonism that drive a story forward and make a reader want to read on. The strength of a story is determined by the forces of antagonism because the protagonist can only be as strong as the forces of antagonism push her to be. If a story's force of antagonism is weak, then the story will also be weak. Now, I'm not recommending we throw everything at the protagonist. The forces of antagonism also need to be appropriate for the type of story that's being told. For example, in Legally Blonde, Elle doesn't dangle from a cliff with an evil overlord threatening to tread on her fingers. She has other forces of antagonism. So I'm just going to quickly go through a bit of a list that I've identified from multiple sources about the types of antagonism that I've seen so far. Now, there's 5, but I am open to adding some more throughout the season or refining them even further. So the first one is the villain. So this is the person with evil intentions trying to destroy the protagonist. The second is the conflict creator. So this character's goal directly conflicts with the protagonist's want. Number 3 is inanimate forces. So this is non-human powers or elements such as the weather, gravity, time, wildlife, or other environmental factors. Number 4 is corrupt entities. So entities that pose a challenge or a threat to the protagonist's goals, or a corrupt or immoral entity that can sometimes act as a more systematic version of the evil antagonist. And then number 5, the protagonists themselves. And this is where the protagonist's own insecurities or fears creates an internal conflict that again stops them from trying to reach their ultimate goals. So Legally Blonde did cause me also to think about societal expectations or stereotypes as a force of antagonism. So I can't see where this is covered in the list above, but by the end of the season, we'll see if it comes out enough to maybe be added to the list. But I do see this as a bit of a force of antagonism for Elle in this story. So what I'm interested in looking at are some questions. So I've asked myself some questions or set up some questions for myself to look at and answer as I go through and analyze each movie this season. So these are: what type of antagonism is used in the story? And is there more than one type used? Do the forces of antagonism have their own logic or rationale for their actions? How is the antagonist defeated or subdued? And then finally, how does the force of antagonism meet the expectations of the genre or serve the story? So I've already learnt a great deal this week. So in this week that I've been focusing on the forces of antagonism, and like most elements of story, when you first turn your attention towards them, I'm only starting to scratch the surface. So I'm really looking forward to diving into this a bit more. But Valerie, did you have anything that I've missed or things that you wanted to add about the forces of antagonism?
This is really interesting because I've done a little bit of study on forces of antagonism myself, and I didn't have categories that were as specific as yours, but there's certainly food for thought in having a clearer distinction of what the forces of antagonism are, because I tend to look at them as, they're either inside the protagonist or they're outside the protagonist, right? So when I say inside, that's when the character is their own worst enemy. When it's the character holding themselves back from, attaining their goal, achieving their dream, whatever. Or external could be, like you said, like a villain, right? Like a bad guy, a person. It could also be society. And when society is the force of antagonism, what tends to happen is that there are a number of characters in the story that represent the different ideologies in the society. And believe it or not, a really good example of this is Mrs. Doubtfire. If you ever wanted an excuse to rewatch Mrs. Doubtfire, I am giving it to you now. Just look at all of the forces of antagonism, societal forces of antagonism playing on Daniel. Now, his ex-wife is clearly the main antagonist. But you've got the next door neighbor. She's an antagonist. And at the beginning, when Daniel has the children's party, you've got the woman who is trying to help Daniel find a job. There is his new boss in the film company. They're everywhere. And they all represent a different perspective that society has on divorce, on effective divorce on children, the role of the father in a divorce. It's quite interesting. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you figure out this season.
Do you know, as you say that, though, so societal force, society as a force of antagonism, I think that's where stereotypes and those sorts of things would fit in. So I really like that. I like that idea. But all right, so I have also come up with some requirements for the forces of antagonism, and I did this just to help sort of understand what is it that you want the force of antagonism or forces of antagonism to do in a story. So I've got well, as I mentioned previously, the forces of antagonism must be suitable for the type of story that we're telling. They must represent a real and potential danger to the protagonist. And I don't mean that always in a life-threatening way, especially as we watch a movie like Legally Blonde, but the fact that Elle's view of where she needs to be in the world is put into danger, is actually logical for the type of story that we're telling, and also puts that danger right front and center for Elle to overcome. The forces of antagonism drive the shifting of power to and fro between the protagonist and the antagonist. And I think Legally Blonde is a really good example. There are really clear shifts in that power dynamic, and where it starts to become less and less for Elle as we move through the story. And that's something that I've really just noticed in the study and the reading that I've been doing, and I could really see that in this movie. And finally, if the force of antagonism is human or human-like, I think it must have a logic and rationale for their actions. So an antagonist who's just bad because they're bad is not very interesting. And it also, I think, misses the opportunity to create tension in the reader, so that when the reader can see the antagonist's points of view, we're also dealing with not just the antagonism on the page between the protagonist and the antagonist, but we're actually empathizing a lot as a reader between those two points of view. So I've just put those out there as things that I think we require in our forces of antagonism. Right, so the forces of antagonism in Legally Blonde. So Legally Blonde, I think, is a good movie to start studying this concept, because they're very easy to identify in this movie, and there are some really solid examples of how the forces of antagonism work. So, okay, I think there are two types of antagonistic forces at work in this story. The first are the conflict creators. So this is the characters whose goals directly conflict with the protagonist's wants. And then the second, I think, is the stereotypes associated with women like Elle, as well as that of what it means to be a law student, what you have to look like or what you potentially have to act like. So I think those two stereotypes are at play in this movie. And Elle butts up against those quite a lot. But I'm just going to have a little soapbox moment about the stereotypes in this movie. So there are aspects of this movie which are quite frustrating to watch when you're a blonde person. And as much as Elle graduates top of her class, gets Emmett at the end, all the women of less substance in this movie are blonde. So we have Paulette, there's Brooke and Margot, as well as Elle herself. And all the serious women are brunettes. So Vivian, the judge, Professor Stromwell, Enid, and the defense lawyer. So I don't think this movie is really a statement about correcting or challenging stereotypes. So right, I'll hop off my soapbox now and get on with my analysis. So an interesting aspect of the conflict creators as forces of antagonism, I think, is that they can be either negative or positive. And the negative conflict creators put obstacles in the way of the protagonist to keep them where they are. So here we see these types of antagonists get in the way of Elle's want in the movie, which is to get her man back by becoming the very thing she believes he wants her to be. So here are some examples, or here are who I have identified as these negative conflict creators. So there's Warner, because he breaks up with Elle so that he can marry the right person to further his career. And he also tells Elle further in the movie that she's not smart enough to do law at Harvard. There's the academic requirements of going to law. They are obstacles and they are things that Elle must overcome, as well as the professors. So Professor Stromwell is very much set up to have high expectations about the type of pre-reading or assignments that she wants her students to have, and she embarrasses Elle in front of the rest of her class. Professor Callahan and his intern program are things that Elle must strive to achieve, especially when there are only 4 people who will be selected for that program. And he also has a proposition for her about the summer associate role once she gets into that intern program. And I won't say too much more about that because I think his behaviour is pretty self-evident and it's very predictable. But again, it's a big force of antagonism for Elle, and I think it forces her to confront the very real problems that she's facing. And there's also Brooke Wyndham's court case. It's not Brooke herself, but the actual court case is something that Elle has to adapt and overcome to. And there's Vivian Kensington, who's Warner's fiancée. So she's everything that Elle isn't. She's from an old wealthy family. She's smart and ambitious, and she even resembles Jackie Kennedy. And if you go back to what Warner says at the beginning when he breaks up with Elle, that's important to someone like Warner. Now, there are expectations about blondes and their intelligence, and also the type of people who study law, and that's comes out in a way where Elle is socially excluded because they are studying law is a smart people thing. And I think it's Vivian that says that to Elle in the library. So, and Elle has never really faced exclusion or being unpopular or not belonging. And we really get to see that contrast from the beginning of the movie in her sorority house and then once she moves into the law school. And Elle also poses herself, she also is an obstacle to herself. So her internal conflict is between her want, which is marrying Warner, and then her need, which is to accomplish academic success and be more than somebody's wife. So but there are positive forces of antagonism in this movie, and there are positive conflict creators who challenge and encourage Elle to be better and to not give up, especially when Elle wants to go home or when she's regretting her decisions to go to Harvard. So Paulette is one of those positive conflict creators. So she pretty much puts it out there to Elle that she'll help her. She needs to go and get Warner back. And there's Brooke. So Brooke pushes Elle to prove that she is not guilty of murdering her husband. So Brooke tells Elle her alibi as well because she trusts her, but in the same time, she sets that up as an obstacle for Elle because Elle lets everybody know that she knows the alibi, but she can't tell anybody. So the whole team then has to work harder to try and get Brooke off the charges that she's facing. And also Brooke, when she sacks Professor Callahan and engages Elle as her lawyer, has really put Elle in front and centre in this legal case, and Elle has to stretch and extend to be able to win the case and, like Valerie said, use her gifts to be able to get Brooke off. And there's Emmett. So he challenges Elle to take her power as a blonde and to channel it as a greater good. And finally, we see a change with Professor Stromwell and her expectations of Elle. They become positive towards the end. So when Elle wants to give up and go home, Professor Stromwell, who's at the beauty salon, turns around and says, "If you do this, you're not the girl I thought you were." So she changes the expectations for Elle, and Elle then has to live up to some of those newer expectations that she didn't have at the beginning of the movie. So I really watched the power shifts going through this movie, and it was really interesting to see the power shifts between the forces of antagonism and then also between Elle and the positive power, the positive forces and the negative forces, and then Elle. And they all really do push her forward. There's also, though, something that's really interesting is that those power shifts change throughout the movie. So at the beginning of the movie, we really see Elle taking back a level of power. So she gets dumped by Warner, and then she decides that she's going to get into Harvard, and she does that. And so there's a fair amount of time devoted to Elle rising to that challenge. But as we move further through the movie, Elle's ability to take that power back or have some sort of power over those things reduces, and she gets thrown far more antagonistic things before she actually gets to that crisis point. And I found that really interesting. And so that's something to look out for, or something to think of when you're actually planning and plotting your novel. So they are pretty much my main sort of findings from watching Legally Blonde this week. We've got the conflict creators as positive and negative forces of antagonism for Elle, and we also have the stereotypes. So hopefully next week I'll get a bit more time to look into some of those other questions that I've been asking myself about forces of antagonism.
Okay, so today's action step. I want you to consider your own superpower and that of your protagonist. Consider the manuscript you've written up to this point and ask yourself, have you given your protagonist a superpower? Does she or he have a gift? If not, start considering what type of gift you might be able to give them. And also consider what superpower, what gift you have. Maybe you want to give that same superpower to your protagonist. So have fun with it and let me know how you do.
So that wraps it up for this week. Join us again next week when we discuss Bend It Like Beckham. To support the show, please leave us a rating and review and tell your writer friends about us. For even more information about putting story theory into practice, subscribe to Valerie's Inner Circle by visiting valeriefrancis.ca/inner circle, or follow her on Twitter and Instagram at Valerie_Francis. If you'd like to find more out about me, visit melaniehill.com.au or visit me on Facebook as Melanie Hill Author. And remember, story theory doesn't have to be difficult. It's a tool to help you write more, not less. So take it one step at a time and have fun.